1940 Royal Navy Dockyard, the Firth of Forth. Engineers are removing 8 gun barrels from the turrets of HMS Valiant and HMS Warspite, ships that have been fighting since 1915. The barrels are worn. They have fired through Jutland, through the Dardanelles, through 2 decades of exercises and gunnery competitions that peacetime navies use to keep their crews sharp and their weapons understood. By the standard measure of naval ordnance life, these barrels should be approaching the end of their useful service. The engineers fitting them back after relining are not replacing them with something better. They are restoring them to fight again, in the same mountings, on the same ships, in a war their designers had never imagined they would reach. In Berlin, the Kriegsmarine is commissioning Bismarck, her 8 38cm guns fresh from the Krupp factory, each barrel capable of approximately 180 to 210 full-charge rounds before replacement. Built to the most exacting German ordnance standards of the 1930s, the British 15-inch Mark I barrels, being relined at Rosyth in 1940, will fire 335 full-charge equivalent rounds each before they are worn beyond use. They will outlast every Bismarck barrel by a factor that no German ordnance specification anticipated. On ships that critics had been calling obsolete for a decade, this is the story of why Britain's second-hand guns were more lethal than Germany's best, and why the margin was not close. The strategic context that made barrel life matter more than any other single specification began in 1935, when it became clear that the naval treaties limiting battleship construction would not hold. Germany had announced the Scharnhorst class. Japan was building in secrecy that British intelligence could not fully penetrate. Italy had begun modernizing its existing battleships and laying down the Littorio class. The Royal Navy was looking at a 2-ocean threat from Japan, and a simultaneous European threat from Germany and Italy, with a battle fleet that had not commissioned a new capital ship since 1927. The decisions made during the London Naval Treaty years had restricted British battleship main armament to 14 inches, a limitation that the King George V class was being designed around even as every other major naval power moved toward 15 and 16-inch guns. The Queen Elizabeth-class ships, commissioned between 1915 and 1916 with their 15-inch Mark I armament, were no longer the newest ships in the fleet. They were, by 1939, the most experienced ships in the fleet, with gun crews, engineering departments, and gunnery officers who understood the weapon in ways that no specification could reproduce. What the Admiralty possessed in 1939 was not a modern battle fleet. It was a battle fleet that had been operating the most durable naval rifle ever manufactured for 24 years, and had no reason to replace it with anything less capable. To understand why the barrel life comparison between the 15-inch Mark I and the 38cm SKC-34 on Bismarck and Tirpitz reveals something fundamental about naval gunnery doctrine. You have to understand what produces barrel wear in the first place, because the critics, who dismissed the British gun as outdated, were measuring caliber and maximum range without asking what happened to the barrel after the 300th round. The interior surface of a naval gun barrel is lined with a steel alloy, carefully selected to withstand the pressures generated by propellant combustion, which in a battleship gun of this era reached approximately 20 tons per square inch in the fraction of a second between ignition and the shell leaving the muzzle. At those pressures, the propellant gases are hot enough to erode the metal surface of the barrel with every round fired, a process called bore erosion, that gradually widens the rifling grooves, reduces the gas seal around the shell, lowers muzzle velocity, and ultimately destroys the gun's ability to place a shell accurately at long range. The rate at which this erosion proceeds is determined primarily by 2 factors: the maximum pressure generated by the propellant charge, and the temperature of the gases at the moment of peak pressure. Both factors are directly tied to muzzle velocity. A gun designed to achieve high muzzle velocity requires a larger propellant charge burning at higher temperatures, which accelerates erosion and shortens barrel life. A gun designed at moderate muzzle velocity uses a smaller charge at lower peak temperatures and preserves the barrel for significantly more rounds. The British 15-inch Mark I fired its 1,938-pound shell at 2,458 feet per second on standard charge. The German 38cm SKC-34 fired its 1,764-pound shell at 2,990 feet per second. The German gun was faster. It was also destroying its barrels at a rate that made sustained operations a logistics calculation. The British gun never required the numbers the Kriegsmarine's own ordnance department had accepted when approving the SKC-34 for Bismarck and Tirpitz, reflected a deliberate German doctrine that prioritized muzzle velocity and flat trajectory over barrel longevity. A flat trajectory shell arrives at the target with a lower angle of descent, which in German doctrine produced better penetration of vertical armor at medium ranges. The trade-off was explicit. German naval architects understood they were accepting shorter barrel life in exchange for improved medium-range armor penetration characteristics. What German doctrine did not fully account for was the operational consequence of that trade-off in a war fought over years rather than in the single decisive fleet action that German naval planning had always assumed would settle the European naval balance in an afternoon. Bismarck fired 93 heavy shells at HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales in the Denmark Strait engagement on May 24, 1941, and 8 38-centimeter rounds at HMS Dorsetshire and other vessels during her final hours on May 27. She was sunk by that point, so the question of her barrel condition at round 101 was never operationally tested. But the wear rate built into the SKC-34's design meant that a Bismarck that survived the Denmark Strait and continued fleet operations would have faced barrel replacement within roughly 80 to 110 additional full-charge rounds. Tirpitz, which spent most of the war in Norwegian fjords under threat of air and midget submarine attack, fired her main armament in anger only once, against the shore installations at Spitsbergen in September 1943, expending a modest number of rounds in an operation that had more political than military significance. Her barrels survived the war, not because the design was durable, but because she was never used. If you're enjoying this look at how Britain's most unfashionable ordnance decision produced the most combat-effective naval rifle of the Second World War, a quick subscribe helps the channel keep producing deep dives like this one. The 15-inch Mark I's combat record across both world wars produced the barrel life data that made the comparison concrete. At Jutland on May 31, 1916, the 8 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships in the Grand Fleet fired a combined total of 1,115 15-inch rounds during the main fleet engagement and the night action that followed. Individual ships fired between 90 and 215 rounds depending on their position in the line and the duration of their engagement with German capital ships. No barrel replacement was required following the action. The guns that had fired 215 rounds at Jutland were operational for the next engagement. HMS Warspite, which fired 168 15-inch rounds during the battle, was back in service within weeks of the action, her guns performing within normal accuracy tolerances. The barrel life budget of 335 full-charge equivalent rounds meant that Jutland had consumed roughly half of each barrel's service life, leaving the other half for the remainder of the First World War. And as it turned out, all of the second. The relined barrels returning to service in 1940 were not compromised weapons. They were weapons that had been brought back to near-new internal dimensions through a process the Royal Navy had developed specifically because the 15-inch Mark I's other qualities made it worth preserving rather than replacing. At Calabria on July 9, 1940, HMS Warspite fired her 15-inch guns at the Italian fleet flagship Giulio Cesare, at a range of 26,400 yards. The longest confirmed hit ever recorded by one moving warship on another in naval history. The shell that struck Giulio Cesare amidships had been in flight for approximately 51 seconds after leaving the barrel. At that range, the shell was descending at an angle of approximately 20 degrees, falling nearly vertically onto the Italian ship's deck armor, rather than striking her side belt. The hit started a fire that killed 115 Italian sailors, caused extensive structural damage, and forced Admiral Campioni to break off the engagement and withdraw his fleet from a battle he had started with a significant numerical advantage. The shell that achieved this had been fired from a gun designed in 1912, from a ship commissioned in 1913, by a barrel that was already in its second decade of operational service. The Italian Navy's response to Calabria was to curtail fleet operations and avoid situations where British battleships could exploit their long-range gunnery advantage. A single 15-inch shell fired from a gun that critics had been declaring obsolete for 10 years had shaped Italian naval strategy for the remainder of the war. The comparison against the alternative that Britain was actually producing makes the barrel life argument even more precise. The King George V class, entering service in 1940 and 1941, carried the 14-inch Mark VII gun firing a 1,590-pound shell at 2,483 feet per second. The 14-inch gun's barrel life was approximately 340 rounds, marginally better than the 15-inch Mark I. But it fired was 348 pounds lighter. That 348-pound difference was not incidental. At long range, where velocity had been substantially reduced by air resistance, the heavier shell carried more residual kinetic energy to the target and therefore penetrated armor more effectively than the terminal ballistics of a lighter, initially faster shell. In the exchange at the Bismarck engagement, HMS Prince of Wales, armed with the newer 14-inch guns, achieved 3 hits on Bismarck, one of which penetrated and caused significant flooding. HMS Hood, also present, had no opportunity to fully engage before her magazine detonated. Bismarck's 38-centimeter guns, firing their lighter shells at higher velocity, had achieved 5 hits on Hood and Prince of Wales combined in the Denmark Strait before Prince of Wales broke off the action. The weight of shell comparison favored the older British design. The barrel life comparison favored it by a factor of nearly 2. The only metric on which the German gun outperformed the British was muzzle velocity, and muzzle velocity was the quality that was consuming its own barrels. HMS Warspite's service record between 1914 and 1945 produced the most comprehensive single-ship demonstration of what the 15-inch Mark I's durability meant operationally. She fought at Jutland in 1916, firing 168 rounds. She was reconstructed between 1934 and 1937. Her turret elevation increased to 30 degrees, adding nearly 8,000 yards to her maximum range. She struck Giulio Cesare at Calabria in 1940. She destroyed the Italian heavy cruisers Zara and Fiuma at Cape Matapan in March 1941. Firing at 3,000 yards in darkness, her searchlight illuminated targets presenting full broadsides that her gunners could not miss at that range. She bombarded German shore positions in support of the Normandy landings in June 1944. Her 15-inch shells reaching 8 miles inland to destroy road junctions and armored concentrations that field artillery could not reach, and tactical aircraft could not reliably locate in overcast conditions. Between 1914 and 1944, Warspite fired her main armament in anger more times than any other capital ship in Royal Navy history. Her barrels were replaced on a schedule driven by measured wear, not by combat damage. The guns that fired at Normandy in 1944 were not the guns that fired at Jutland in 1916, because 30 years of operational service eventually consumed even a 335-round barrel, but the replacements were of identical manufacture and identical performance, fitted into turrets that had themselves been operating continuously for 3 decades. No other capital ship gun system in any navy achieved a comparable combination of service life, operational tempo, and sustained accuracy. The Italian 15-inch gun fitted to the Littorio class, the Andrea Doria class after modernization, and the rebuilt Conte di Cavour, achieved the longest maximum range of any comparable weapon, exceeding 46,000 yards through extreme muzzle velocity. The Italian Ansaldo 300 Nelly-node gun fired its shell at 2,789 feet per second, producing a maximum range figure that appeared in every naval comparison table of the era, and led Italian naval planners to conclude they had built the dominant long-range gunnery weapon in the Mediterranean. The barrel life of the Italian gun was approximately 110 to 140 rounds. At Calabria, the Italian fleet opened fire at extreme range and achieved no hits on the British battleships. The dispersion of Italian 15-inch salvos at long range was a documented problem attributed in part to the erosion effects of the gun's high muzzle velocity on the barrel rifling, which degraded the shell's rotational stability over the long flight time required to reach 40,000+ yards. The gun that could reach farthest on paper was the gun that could hit least reliably in practice, because the velocity that produced the range was simultaneously destroying the precision of the barrel that launched the shell. The British gun, trading maximum range for moderate velocity, had tighter dispersion at operational ranges because its barrel rifling remained within specification for a far greater number of rounds. By 1944, the 15-inch Mark I had been in continuous Royal Navy service for 30 years. It had fired in anger at Jutland, at Calabria, at Matapan, during the pursuit of Bismarck, in the Norwegian campaign, at the landings in Sicily, at the landings at Salerno, and now at Normandy. The gun that critics had described as a stopgap in 1912, a gamble ordered into production without completed prototype trials by a First Lord of the Admiralty who wanted to outgun Germany before Germany could respond, had outlasted every attempt to supersede it, outlasted every foreign weapon built to the same caliber, and outlasted the war that had been intended to render it obsolete. The Krupp factory's 38-centimeter SKC-34, Germany's answer to the British gun a quarter-century later, had been built to finer tolerances, finished to higher surface standards, and designed with the full benefit of the intervening decades of metallurgical research. It fired its shell faster and farther. It would have worn out in roughly half the rounds. What the barrel life comparison proved was not that German ordnance engineering was inferior to British. It was not. Krupp's manufacturing standards in the 1930s were among the finest in the world, and the SKC-34 was a weapon of genuine sophistication built to a specification that reflected serious professional thinking about what naval gunnery required. What the comparison proved was that the specification itself had been wrong about what mattered. Maximum velocity and extreme range were the qualities that impressed naval analysts, appeared in comparative tables, and drove public perception of which navy had the better weapon. Barrel life, dispersion at operational ranges, and the ability to sustain accurate fire across a long war were the qualities that determined which navy could actually win engagements. The British gun had been built around the second set of qualities in 1912, not because British ordnance engineers were more far-sighted than German ones, but because Churchill's 1912 decision to prioritize shell weight over velocity had accidentally embedded the correct trade-off into a gun that then had 30 years to prove it. Germany's best battleship cannon outlasted Bismarck by 3 days. Britain's second-hand guns outlasted the war.